I'm Jeremy Scahill from Drop Site News, dropsitenews.com. And as I'm speaking to you right now, there is news coming out of Egypt that the Hamas delegation in the last 24 hours that is trying to pursue a reopening of the path to negotiations for a ceasefire and an end to Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, that no agreement has yet been reached. I've been talking to sources close to the Palestinian negotiating team. And what we understand is that the Egyptian mediators have presented essentially a set of demands from the Israeli side that set out conditions for resuming negotiations. This is not conditions for a ceasefire. This is conditions for resuming negotiations. And among the conditions that the Israelis are insisting on just to restart negotiations is that Hamas and other Palestinian resistance factions agree to total disarmament. Now, what I'm hearing from sources, and we also have reporting in other media outlets, is that the Palestinian side is saying that this is not just a red line. In the words of one official within the Palestinian resistance, it's 1,000 red lines. They're saying that this is a non-starter. And also that what the Egyptian mediators presented Hamas was not actually anything new, that the Israelis are continuing to demand that the Palestinian side release a very large number of Israeli captives, and the Israelis will in turn release Palestinians who are being held by Israel, but that the Israeli side is saying that these exchanges of more captives are not going to be linked in any way to Israel actually ending its genocidal assault on Gaza or any other assurances that the original framework from the agreement that Israel signed with Hamas in January was going to be respected. We're going to continue to follow this story. Hamas says that within the next 48 hours, they're going to be delivering an official response to this so-called proposal that was put in front of them by the Egyptian side. You can continue to monitor our social media feed on x.com, which we run as a sort of almost 24-hour news service, and we're covering all developments on the ground in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and beyond. Well, today we're going to be discussing an extraordinary legal application that was submitted last week in London by the Palestinian resistance movement Hamas, arguing that the British government should remove its designation of Hamas as a proscribed terror organization, and that the government should recognize Hamas's legitimate role as a Palestinian resistance movement that is engaged in a struggle for self-determination and liberation. Now, in a legal brief submitted to the British Home Secretary, senior Hamas leader Musa Abu Marzouk, who's been with the organization from the very beginning, rejected allegations that the Hamas movement is an anti-Semitic terror organization and asserted that Hamas poses no threat to Western nations, specifically to the UK, and argued that Hamas and its fighters have never engaged in an armed operation outside of the boundaries of historic Palestine. Now, to argue this case in the UK, Hamas enlisted a team of British lawyers to represent its appeal to the British Home Secretary and to challenge this terror designation. The British government designated Qassam brigades, which of course is the armed wing of Hamas, as a proscribed group in 2001, but not Hamas as a whole. Remember, Hamas is not just the armed faction. Hamas is also a political organization that in 2006 won a democratic election, not just in Gaza, but in all of the occupied Palestinian territories. That resulted in Ismail Haniyeh becoming the prime minister. And of course, Israel last summer assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Well, in 2021, the British Home Office actually designated all of Hamas as a terror organization. And when they did so, the Home Office said, quote, "The government now assesses that the approach of distinguishing between the various parts of Hamas is artificial. Hamas is a complex but single terrorist organization," end of quote. Hamas is represented in the UK by the Riverway law firm, and they in turn have enlisted two British barristers to present the case for becoming delisted as a terror group. It's important to note none of these lawyers are being paid. Hamas is not paying them, and they have said that they have taken this case on a pro bono basis. It's very important because there is an active smear campaign right now happening against these lawyers, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Now, the UK Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has 90 days to answer Hamas's petition. And if she rejects it and maintains the terror designation for Hamas, then the case would go before something sort of like a tribunal for an appeal. And that legal process could still overturn the designation, even if the Home Secretary rejects this application. Joining me right now is one of the lawyers that has been enlisted to present Hamas's case to the Home Secretary. Franck Magennis is from the law firm Garden Court Chambers. Frank, thanks so much for being with us here at Drop Site.
Jeremy, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Now, we're going to talk about all of the details of this case or of this legal application to the Home Secretary. And we're also going to talk about another case that you're involved with, which is the effort to get war crimes charges brought against 10 British citizens who joined the Israeli military and deployed to Gaza. And we're going to talk about both of these, but there's actually breaking news right now. And that is, I think a lot of the people that follow Drop Site, we've been posting videos of some of your media appearances in the UK with mainstream British media organizations. And there has been a campaign to try to make Franck Magennis the issue here. In fact, you've said that some of these so-called journalists have tried to put a target on your back because of their inference or direct statements that by representing a client, you become that client. And of course, this is a very dangerous allegation to make against lawyers. But I want to begin with this, which is that Garden Court Chambers, which is the firm where you work, has put out a statement just moments ago, effectively trying to separate themselves from you. And I'm going to read this statement, and I want to get your response to this. It says, Garden Court Chambers is aware of one of its members taking on a case in which they've been instructed to present an application to the Home Secretary requesting that a proscribed organization be deproscribed. All members of Garden Court Chambers are members of the Independent Bar of England and Wales, are self-employed, and are regulated by the Bar Standards Board. Professional conduct of members is not regulated by Garden Court Chambers. The barrister concerned, they're referring to you, but they don't name you, has chosen to undertake this case in his individual capacity, and this in no way indicates that Garden Court Chambers supports his client. It concludes, we take this opportunity as a Chambers to make clear that we unequivocally condemn racism and anti-Semitism in all its forms. That's the law firm that you are working with, Frank, and they have just issued this statement that I think quite clearly is denouncing you and kicking you under the bus. Your response?
Well, Jeremy, thank you for raising that statement. It's, I'm speaking to you from Garden Court Chambers, the building in central London, which is interesting. I think I have to play my cards relatively close to my chest in respect of that statement for reasons that you may understand. It's the subject of an ongoing internal dialogue. It's worth noting I wasn't consulted before that statement went out, which you may think is astonishing. And it's also my understanding that there are a number of people within Garden Court who weren't consulted. And so we will see if that statement remains on the website, but clearly it speaks for itself and the people who wrote it.
So you're saying that there was no discussion with you whatsoever where concerns were raised that you had taken this case?
Yes, again, I do have to play my cards a bit close to my chest on this, and so forgive me for being a bit circumspect, but suffice it to say that I am due to meet with my heads of chambers later today, and that is the first time that I am meeting with them since the story broke on Wednesday, and they were informed before Wednesday that the story was going to break, and it's only now that they've seen fit to meet with me, and I suppose your viewers can read into that what they will about the way that my chambers is approaching my safety and this issue.
You know, I've been a journalist for 25 years or so, and I often deal with lawyers who are representing clients that are accused of terrorism. I've spent a lot of time with lawyers, for instance, who represented Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American-born imam who President Obama ordered assassinated, and in fact did assassinate in Yemen. Lawyers that have represented clients at Guantanamo, clients who are from what we call in the US designated terror organizations, or are accused of providing material support for terror organizations. And I think that any reasonable people that believe in the notion of Western democracy or the right of due process would recognize that you judge a society based on how it treats the least of its people, or the people that maybe are considered the most unsavory, and that this should not be a line of attack against lawyers who say, I want to represent a client based on the much broader implications of this case, but also because people accused of very serious crimes or designated as terror organizations have a right to challenge those designations either in the US or in the UK.
Exactly.
In your case, as I've watched interviews with you, you are essentially being put on trial by media for having dared to take on this case. Before we get into the specifics, talk about that dynamic and the danger of what you're facing now in the UK because of that line of attack.
Yeah, thank you for giving me a proper platform to actually respond. And I'm grateful to you, Jeremy, because I'm not trying to be overly sycophantic, but I'm so grateful to you for the work that you do. You're such a serious journalist, and it's such a refreshing contrast to the way that I've been treated by the right-wing media. But it's not a surprise. They're not serious journalists. And I said that to several of them to their face, right? I called the framing of one of the ridiculous LBC people I spoke to, I put it to him that his framing was a disgrace. And that's because he was talking about a British woman who had been murdered on October 7th. And that, of course, is a tragedy. It's an atrocity, right? And I sort of tried to point out, look, this is atrocity propaganda. And they don't seem to understand, these right-wing hacks, that an atrocity can have taken place. And that's still atrocity propaganda, right? Doubtless, several, more than 1,000 people were murdered on October 7th. That's horrific. That's tragic, right? That's an extensive loss of life, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's just that these right-wing people are using that to justify the people who've lost their lives, just even while you and I are speaking, right? That's what we mean when we talk about atrocity propaganda. So that's been one approach. And then as far as the personal attacks on me are concerned, I mean, it's just a disgusting affront to the rule of law. I mean, I have my criticisms of the liberal understanding of the rule of law and the way that the British Constitution claims to care about law. I come from the occupied north of Ireland, where we know how they treat human rights lawyers if they're good enough at doing their jobs, right? So those of us who are paying close enough attention understand that the British state and the Constitution and British society tells itself certain stories about how, look, people are entitled to a lawyer, and whatever you might think of them, that's the rule of law, and a lawyer is not the same as their client. That has gone completely out the window in this case. It's what you'd expect. The British establishment doesn't play by its own rules. It plays the man, not the ball, if the player is too good. And I mean, we have the high-profile examples that I've spoken about extensively in some of the other interviews. I won't repeat them here because I'm wary about speaking for the families of people whose lawyer relatives were attacked in the ways that they have been. But I think the crucial point, perhaps for your viewers to understand, given that you've actually given me some space to talk and you're not cutting across me in the way that those ridiculous hacks have done, the point is, if we think of an analogy with, say, a British Tory barrister who runs for Parliament, right, as often happens, barristers love to run for Parliament in this country, and fails to obtain election. So they go back to their practice at the bar. So now everyone knows, all right, well, that person's a Tory. They ran for the Tory party in the election. And let's say another colleague of that person in the Tory party gets accused of a crime and gets embroiled in some scandal. No one would say, well, hold on, you're acting for a Tory and you yourself have Tory politics, so it must be that you're the same as your client. Why have you decided to take on the case of someone who has the same politics as you? These right-wing people would never ask such a question because it's in the order of things for barristers to be Tories. I'm not here to talk about my personal politics because I'm here in my capacity as a lawyer, but I am an individual who has my own views. And the fact that I have personal views that might be extremely critical of Israeli apartheid and its genocide and the fact that it's an ethno-state and all the rest of it, the fact that I come from the north of Ireland and I'm extremely critical of the empire that colonized my homeland, these are all my personal views. I'm entirely within my right as a person to express my personal views at the same time as being a professional who acts for someone else. And so when they say, oh, they're deliberately, some of them very deliberately, I think either out of malice or ignorance or some heady combination of the two, certainly that Talk TV segment I did, I don't think the man's particularly malicious. I just think he's completely out of his depth, as I said to him. He doesn't understand the principle we're talking about here. But when these people come at me and say, well, you're just the same as your client, how dare you act for this disgraceful client? The obvious response is, which one? Sorry, which of the thousands of clients I've represented do you say that I'm being conflated with? Is it the 15-year-old kid from Afghanistan whose father was murdered by the Taliban? Is that the client you're referring to? Or is it the Jewish Israelis that I've represented in the past? Is that the client you're saying that I'm the same as? Oh no, you've singled out this one client, and now you're saying that I'm forever to be indelibly marked by the fact of my having accepted a brief them. It's disgraceful. They're either idiots or they're dangerous, possibly both. They need to stop it and live up to the standards of their own purported liberal constitution and recognize that Section 4 of the Terrorism Act 2000 says if you find yourself on this list as an organization, or indeed if you are affected by the designation, you have a right to make an application. That's what's happened. It would be good if the right-wing press, their low and incredibly racist standards notwithstanding, could stop playing the man not the ball. It's getting embarrassing.
Yeah, and of course, in the United States, we have a long history of Jewish lawyers who have represented, anti-Semitic, hateful organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, the American Civil Liberties Union has represented some of the most vile people produced by American society on the principle that if we strip away their basic rights to be as horrible as they are, then this will be weaponized against others. We're seeing this play out in Germany as well. We had Alex Gorski on, the lawyer who's taking on the German government for its efforts to target people based on their speech against Israel's genocide. But let's talk about the merits of the application here, and I really want you to give people a detailed overview of this. So let's begin at the beginning. Explain first the process of proscription of terror organizations in the UK. First, explain what it means if you're designated and how the designation happens.
Absolutely. I will go into detail. And what I would say is that if your viewers are interested in understanding this in as much detail as they want and can, the papers have been made available at a website called hamascase.com, and the pleadings are freely available to be downloaded. So those interested in talking about this very important conversation can go and read the documents for themselves. And it's a shame, as I said, that the right-wing media hasn't given space to discuss this, because it's important, right? I know a lot of people will disagree with the arguments that are being made there, but they're important arguments, and we need to have a respectful dialogue about this. As to the process, which is what you've asked me about, the Terrorism Act 2000 was a consolidation of precursor legislation that was trialed in the north of Ireland to deal with the issue of Irish republicanism, right? And the fact that there were a number of different groups that sought or fought what they said was a national liberation struggle. And the British invented this technique of designating those organizations terrorist organizations. And once the organization is so designated, it becomes a criminal offense to be a member. And so, I've talked a lot in the last week, well, in the last few decades. I talk about Bobby Sands all the time because he's a titanic figure, but he was caught by this sort of designation, right? So the idea is that you make the organization illegal, and then any of its members can be locked up for, I think it was 10 years under the precursor legislation, right? You get 10 years for membership of the IRA, it becomes quite difficult to be a member of the IRA, and that's the intended effect, all right? Now, that's as you might expect. I mean, the British state was fighting an army, what they said was an army, the Irish Republican Army. But in the case of Hamas, the British state is, of course, fighting Hamas, but it's not fighting it in Britain. It's fighting it in Palestine. The act creates a number of offences that go beyond mere membership, right? You're not allowed to express support. You're not allowed to invite support. You're not allowed to attend a meeting. So what it does is the deliberate effect of the Terrorism Act is to make it extremely difficult to even talk about these organizations, much less be a member. And that's particularly problematic, of course, when, as in the case of Hamas, the organization has started winning elections. It forms not just the military wing, but the civil wing is deeply implicated in the administration of the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, and it just makes it extremely difficult to do anything with respect of, sending aid to Palestinians, talking to your political opponents. All of that stuff is being completely chilled. And I would say, just speaking plainly, I've received a lot of personal support, so have the other members of the legal team, a lot of private messages, a lot of people in the YouTube comments and so on. But the fact is that the people who oppose this application are free to talk very, very openly about it because their position is hegemonic, right? The British government is currently engaged alongside Israel in the mass murder of Palestinians because they're viewed as a racial threat to the racial purity of Israel's ethno-state. Whereas people who oppose that find it extremely difficult to speak up because they're worried that they'll literally be prosecuted. So the act is operating as it's intended to, but this application is based upon, I would say, an extremely historically literate analysis of what it means to bring an end to a conflict as intractable as something like that which we see in Palestine. And those who are willing to engage with it in good faith might see a ray of hope of what a peaceful solution might look like, right? My client in the application, there's a witness statement by Dr. Marzouk, two witness statements, I should say, one much lengthier, which talks about the events of October 7th. And that witness statement goes into all kinds of details about what Hamas, both of those witness statements and the application in general go into Hamas's position. And one crucial thing they talk about is a hudna, right? This concept of an Islamic truce, a long Islamic truce, that it's a sort of religious, it's a religious transgression to break such a sacred truce. That's what Hamas are calling for. They're calling for a long-term ceasefire, and they are willing to do so on the basis of the 1967 borders. So all of that comes out in the application. It's just a shame that the right-wing press aren't interested in hearing what is actually said in that application. They're just interested in hitting me with stupid attack lines about how I did it for free or whatever.
Right. Let me ask you though about so you're explaining the proscription process, and you had in 2001, as I mentioned earlier, the Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas, was designated under this law, and then 20 years later, you had Hamas as a political entity, and of course, Hamas, as you said, it's a political party, it's a social movement, it is certainly an armed resistance faction. But it also is an elected government since 2006 that has provided civil services, basic services in Gaza. I mean, in fact, one thing no one ever talks about, if you go back and look at public opinion polling in Gaza prior to October 7th, many of the gripes that people had in Gaza are similar to gripes that you hear about the government in London or New York or Berlin, because Hamas is not just a unidimensional entity, but the Home Secretary engaged in a kind of extreme version of what Paul Bremer called de-Baathification in Iraq, which was essentially anyone in any way connected to Hamas, even if you were a garbage collector, but you were working for Hamas, this makes you part of a proscribed terror organization. Talk about though what that meant when at the time, I believe it was Priti Patel was the Home Secretary. When she made this designation, what was at play there?
Yes, that's a really helpful question. I suppose the starting point is to attack Priti Patel's credibility. I mean, it's not that it's difficult to do. She's obviously an extremely racist right-wing politician, and she was personally criticized even by her own colleagues for her dealings with the apartheid state of Israel, right? So she's a person who already lacks this credibility because she's shown herself to be such a staunch partisan of Zionism. Her reasoning for adding the political wing to the designated list has been staunchly criticized. She talks about anti-Semitism, and that's something that we address extensively in the application, right? She's trying to, and we're familiar with the way that these completely debased, utterly degraded definitions of anti-Semitism are used to attack anyone who supports Palestinian rights. So the familiar playbook. Her reasoning is ridiculous, and we explain why, and we do so in detail in the application. So that's part of the reasoning. And then part of it, as I try to get into with this LBC chap, whose name I forget, he was saying something about, they're a threat to British people, right? Hamas are a threat to British people. So that's supposed to be part of the reasoning. And it's just obvious nonsense. It's completely ridiculous. I cannot stress enough how stupid that reasoning is. The point being made there,
are they saying, sorry to cut you off, because I think this is an important point. The argument would be that because there were British citizens who were killed on October 7th, that this exactly is relevant to the terror designation in the UK.
Well, the point is that they, when the British government tries, as it does so often, to argue that black is white, they sort of have to do these gymnastic reasoning, right? So part of the guidance and the principles that are supposed to constrain the discretion, right? Secretary of State has this extremely broad discretion to decide who she wants to add to the list, right? She could add the Ukrainian military if she wanted to. She could add the IDF if she wanted to. She absolutely could. There is no basis for doubting that, right? The definition of terrorism, there's a case called Crown and Gull. It's a Supreme Court case which talks about this very issue. And they were sort of saying, in that case, they were exploring the way that, well, hold on, this guy was sharing videos of things that were taking place and armed conflict. And they were saying, well, hold on, the videos he's sharing are lawful under international humanitarian law. And I summarize or paraphrase, but the Supreme Court said, yeah, well, that doesn't matter. Like we accept the definition of terrorism in this act is extremely broad. It goes far beyond things that we accept are lawful under international humanitarian law, but we're going to allow it anyway because it's not a creature of international humanitarian law. It's a domestic prescription regime. Interesting to note in passing that case, Crown and Gould, the charges that the man was facing, Mr. Gould, one of them included sharing videos in relation to Palestine, and that was the one. If you go and read the judgment for the law nerds out there, you go and read the judgment. That's the one in relation to Palestine, where the prosecution wasn't actually successful because, well, the reasoning speaks for itself. So very, very broad definition. So the point is, she has this very broad discretion, the Secretary of State, and she could say, well, both sides of this conflict are committing terrorist acts. Clearly, both sides are caught by the definition. She could say, should I designate the ethno-state that views non-Jews as a racial threat and is enacting a genocide to the list of terrorist organizations, or should I add the group Hamas or some of the other groups, should I add them to the list? And what's clear is that because the British government is participating in the genocide, right? So it's not just that they're complicit. Matt Kennard has been very good on this, right? They're not just complicit, they are participating. They're flying surveillance flights over from their Cyprus military bases. They're sending bombs. That's not complicity, that's participation. They're participating in a genocide. And so it's obvious why they chose to, with their very, very broad discretion, they said, right, let's apply it to Hamas. So that's part of the reasoning. The British point, I mean, to have a chance to actually respond without being cut off, the British point is just silly. It's like, the military wing, it doesn't make any sense to say that they pose a threat to people in Britain. They've never done any operations in Britain, and they've explicitly stated they have no intention of doing so. They confine their operations to the territory of historic Palestine. But the civilian wing, the political wing, poses a threat to people in Britain. That's just made up. It's complete nonsense. There's no basis for suggesting that that Hamas's political wing, let alone their military wing, to be honest, poses any threat to people in Britain. Now that's obviously different, and perhaps we can get into this later when we talk about the 10 British people who are facing prosecution or potential prosecution because they went to serve in the Israeli military while they committed genocide. So hopefully they will be prosecuted. I mean, it's like, what? So a British person goes to serve in a Israeli military while it commits a genocide because of their supposed God-given right to return there on the basis of their race. And then a Palestinian person exercises the Palestinian right to pick up guns, to use armed force to resist an occupier, exercises that right. Say they kill a British soldier who's serving or a British person who's serving in the Israeli military. By the Secretary of State's logic, it's somehow Hamas that's attacking Britain and not literally Britain attacking Hamas. It is black is white stuff. It's like, well, I think the emperor does have clothes. And it's like, with respect, I'm tired, and people are tired of being gaslit and being told that black is white. It's quite clear that Britain is participating in the genocidal mass murder of Palestinians, and the idea that it's Hamas that poses a threat to Britain is a disgusting disavowal of the naked reality that we've all seen on our phones and video screens these last 18 months.
Let's talk about, you alluded to it here, but let's talk about it more explicitly. The threat that this poses in your assessment to basic free speech in the United Kingdom. And we have a similar dynamic, of course, happening in the United States right now, where the chief executive, Donald Trump, is trampling on any sense of judicial process, due process, First Amendment, free speech rights, to try to criminalize certain forms of speech related to Israel. But you're making, and I have read the application. It's long, but it's an involved legal argument, and anyone who wants to seriously debate this should read it in its entirety before weighing in on it. But one of the arguments that you're making is that this designation is also an attack on broader British society because it limits, by necessity and potentially criminal prosecution, the ability of people in Britain to engage with the historical context of what is Hamas as a political entity. What happens if, as you say in your application, the Israeli state is in a terminal crisis, if there is some change in dynamics in a radical way within the modern state of Israel. talk about the broader free speech implications of this designation and how it affects someone that has no affiliation with Hamas but wants to engage in an honest way on the issues in the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say two things, right? The first is human rights, and the second is history, and the two things are related, right? On human rights, this is a very trite point for lawyers, right? In Britain, we're very familiar with the Human Rights Act, which domesticated the European Convention on Human Rights. Okay, and it's a very important piece of legislation, and obviously it centres human dignity, and that's a key part of what we're talking about, right? So the Liberals and Conservatives looking at this application will think about Article 10, and they'll slot it into their pre-existing culture war discussion about free speech. And I'm happy to address you on free speech because it's an important part of the application. But the thing that I think both Liberals and Conservatives who oppose Hamas for whatever reason will not want to talk about is karama, which is the Palestinian word for dignity, right? They don't want to talk about dignity because if they did, they would oppose the staggering affront to Palestinian dignity that Zionism has always represented, right? And specifically, they would oppose the genocide that the British government, as well as the Israeli government, is currently enacting, right? So that's not rhetoric, Jeremy, right? That's a real legal argument. Okay, there are very interesting cases. Pretty in UK springs to mind, right? Pretty in UK is a case about a woman who had a degenerative disease, wanted to end her own life, but wasn't able to because of her disease, and sought permission for her husband to assist her. And that is a case that talks extensively about dignity. It's a staggeringly moving case, right? All about what does it mean to be a human, right? You think about what human rights are. All systems of human rights, international systems, and certainly the European Convention on Human Rights, are fundamentally founded on protecting humans. And you cannot protect a human without understanding that what a human is somebody who has dignity. So much of the human rights argument that this application is premised on reasserting Palestinian dignity in the face of the genocide that is denying their dignity. And we had, of course, Yoav Gallant in the ICJ calling them animals, right? Like it's completely unacceptable affront to Palestinian dignity, right? You might be really understandably angry that that Hamas and other groups have, enacted October 7th and have killed a lot of people, but you don't lose sight of their humanity. Well, he did lose sight of their humanity, and he lost sight of their dignity. That's an important part of the human rights argument that's being made. The other part is Article 10, right? That's your right to freedom of speech and expression. And what's being said there is that, all right, we can imagine why the British state might want to stop a card-carrying member of Hamas from being a member, because that's a crime, and from expressing support, because that's also a crime. But the problem is that someone who might not be a member of Hamas at all, in fact, might be quite critical of them, but might want to support one specific thing that they've done. They might want to say, well, look, they did X, Y, Z. They agreed to peace talks. They've agreed to the jurisdiction of the ICC. Hypothetically, you understand, they might say, I support Hamas's attempts to bring the ICC to bear on what's happening in Palestine, and they will think, that sounds like a red line. I think I'm committing a crime by saying that sentence. I won't say it. And so, what's absolutely clear is a genocide is happening right now. The logic of the genocide was expressly told to us in frankly staggering display of transparency by the Israeli state, right? They said, yeah, we're gonna, Amalek and all this stuff, like Herzog saying they're all, not true about this rhetoric of innocent civilians, an entire nation is responsible, right? Just openly genocidal rhetoric. And part of what they're saying with that, think about what Herzog was saying in that ICJ genocide judgment from January last year. He was saying, basically, reading between the lines, what he's saying is, you elected this evil regime, those were his words, so he's referring to Hamas, so an entire nation is responsible. So this is part of the application. It's saying the logic of the genocide is to say all of Palestine is responsible for the fact that they elected Hamas, and therefore they can all be treated as military targets, even if they're children, right? So that's the argument from human rights, put concisely and in a way that I hope is legible to your audience, but I'm grateful to you for encouraging them to read it because I've tried to make it a readable thing. And then the second point is the argument from history, which can be stated concisely. I've addressed this extensively in other media outlets, but broadly, the South African example and the example of the North of Ireland is helpful. And it's helpful because the simple principle is that it's not for the British state to tell the Palestinian people who should govern them. The Palestinian people voted for Hamas in 2006. If history tells us anything, it's that we will see peace at some point in Palestine, and it will be because people spoke to organizations that won elections, even and especially when the British government doesn't agree with those organizations.
Is it your is it your contention, because the, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Provisional IRA remains a proscribed organization in the UK?
I've not actually looked that up, but I think that's probably right. Or it's just, I mean, it's become academic, right? Because what's happened is there's subsequent dissident Republican groups that have emerged, and those are the ones that people focus on. Because pursuant to the Good Friday Agreement, the Provisional IRA lay down their weapons, right? So it's become something of an academic question. But yeah, you're right. There's a list of about, I think, 100 groups or something that are prescribed in the UK, and some of those groups are from the north of Ireland. And it might well be the case that the Provisional IRA is still on.
I bring it up because there's an analog also to the United States, which is that Nelson Mandela, when he was released from Robben Island and eventually became the head of state of a freed South Africa, remained on the U.S. designated terrorism watch list, deep into his presidency.
2008. 2008.
Right. I remember when he came to the United States in the 1990s, but his designation was still there. He was still a U.S. government designated terrorist, and it's only very recently that that this has become sort of that it's the untouchable, that you can't talk to people who have been characterized as terror organizations, and an attempt to criminalize people. Go ahead.
Can I just come back on that? Because I mean, this is something I've addressed in another interview with a real journalist, not these hacks. It's a really important point that the British government never prescribed Sinn Féin. They prescribed the Provisional IRA. They never prescribed the political wing of the IRA. Even at the height of the violence in the north of Ireland and in Britain, they never prescribed the IRA's political wing, because it would have been deemed too much of a threat, I suppose, to peace, right? And so that's what's so stunning and indefensible, we say legally, about Priti Patel's decision. Like, it's like, right, fine, you want to prescribe the military wing of an organization. Like, I question whether that's actually a good mechanism for resolving a conflict, but fine, they're literally an army, and you don't want people joining that army. I suppose it makes a certain amount of sense on its own terms. I mean, our application is that the entire thing should be deprescribed, because that's the organization that's on the list. But the political wing, like, no, it's just completely absurd.
Right. I mean, this is part of what I'm getting at. Part of why I also asked about the ongoing prescription, perhaps of some groups, is because what seems to be at play here is an attempt to use this British designation to create an environment where the British government itself is saying these specific groups, even if they have a democratic base, even if they're able to win elections that are viewed as free and fair by the international community, that it's verboten to have any discussions, even with their political wing, or that entity can have any representation in the West to try to argue its case or to try to challenge its characterization.
Exactly, and this is one of the things we get into. So the lawyers, well, maybe I should stop saying that, but some people will be familiar with Article 3 of the first protocol to the European Convention of Human Rights, right? We're really getting into the weeds now, but that is a human right to elections. And that's one of the things we raise in the application, right? You cannot understand the prescription regime without understanding it as, among other things, an affront to Palestinian democracy, right? It's, as I've said, it's not for the British state to decide who the Palestinians should vote for. It's for the Palestinians to decide that. And so what becomes extremely dangerous, I know I've sort of made this point already, but I really want to dwell on it, okay? The British state has obligations under international law. That's a key part of this application. And one of the fools who was interviewing me earlier this week, who is not a lawyer and didn't know what he was talking about, which is fine. It's just he might have said to me, I don't understand this, can you explain? Instead, what he did was to start telling me about how genocide works. He said he didn't want to talk about genocide, he wanted to talk about Hamas. But that's interesting. The application that Hamas have just made, which I drafted, talks extensively about the genocide. So that's why I'm talking about it, Jeremy. I'm not here to try and preempt South Africa's legal case against Israel. It's for the ICJ to determine whether or not, and it will take years for them to hand down their final judgment. But that's not how genocide works under international law. It's a duty on states to take their own view on whether genocide is happening, and if it is, to take such steps as they can, all such steps as they can, to prevent it, to bring it to an end. That's true also of apartheid. And it's certainly true that the British state should not be participating in a genocide, right? We don't have to wait 3 years or whatever it is for the ICJ to come back and confirm that that's what Britain is doing, for it to be the case that it's unlawful if that is what Britain is doing, right? So that's a crucial part of the application. But I want to dwell on this point about the logic of the genocide. a key part of the application is that the decision to prescribe is part of the British state's long-standing support for Zionism, stretching back to 1917 at least, but in reality, it goes back even further than that, right? You talk about, I was reading Andreas Malm's book. He's got a pamphlet out about the destruction of Palestine is the destruction of the earth, and there's some very interesting history in there about the British Navy attacking Acre in 1840, right? And having all these conversations about this fantasy of a Jewish colony, a little loyal Jewish Ulster, as Ronald Storrs, the colonial governor of Jerusalem, called it, right? So it's the logic of a genocide, right? Britain is participating in the logic of a genocide, and the decision to prescribe is part of the same logic that Isaac Herzog was saying the quiet part out loud when he said what he's quoted as saying in the ICJ judgment. The entire nation is responsible because they voted for Hamas, and that's why we can massacre their children because they're not Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, in the very big picture here too, what this is a part of is an attempt that all Western governments, for the most part, have participated in one form or another, to say that Palestinians exist in a separate category unto themselves. That the notion that people have a right to use armed force to engage in an insurrection against colonialism, or to fight for self-determination, or to fight to have their international recognition as a nation state, that when Palestinians do it, it must by default be placed into a category of terrorism. And I think it's also important to recall that Hamas officially endorsed in 2018 and 2019 the Great March of Return, which was a series of, in fact, you can go and find Yahya Sinwar himself speaking about the Great March of Return, the slain leader of Hamas in Gaza, who was killed by the Israelis some months ago. The Great March of Return was a nonviolent mobilization where Palestinians went to the concentration camp walls and fences and engaged in nonviolent protest. And in fact, the Israeli military, some of their snipers, had a competition to see who could shoot the most kneecaps, who could incapacitate permanently the greatest number of Palestinians. So when people say, well, where is the Palestinian Gandhi, or where is the Palestinian Martin Luther King? They've probably killed him multiple times over, first of all, is the answer. But secondly, the message that Palestinians have been given is when you do engage in the kinds of activism that the West supposedly encourages, you get gunned down when you do it. But absolutely. But this cuts to a deeper issue, which is this notion that that the use of armed force by Palestinians in what they believe is a defensive war is by necessity, it must be condemned as terroristic. And it is so factually inaccurate, but also ignores all of history. It ignores every possible arc of history. And it also is clearly saying Palestinians are in a separate category. No, they don't have the same rights that the Americans had when they fought off the British attempts to once again seize the territory that had been created by people fleeing the United Kingdom. There's revolutions the world over fought using these methods. And as your clients have pointed out, and it's accurate historically, Hamas is not in the business of international terrorism. It is not going out and attacking British airplanes. It is not going out and attacking, American embassies. This is a fight that they view as confined to historic Palestine. And it's also for strategic reasons that you can go back and read every leading Palestinian theorist on this, that if the Palestinians were to engage beyond the borders of historic Palestine, it would entirely undermine what they view as the ethics and morality of their cause.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose the point is, who cares what the British Empire has to tell us about how to resist colonialism, right? It's absurd. And there is something of the absurd about this application, right? It's like the British Empire literally colonized Palestine, and we talk about this in detail, right? In some ways, Zionism never would have gotten off the ground without these racist British fantasies for a, quote, little loyal Jewish Ulster, right? And there's that one sentence in the application where we juxtapose that quote, or we merge it with the infamous Israeli general Moshe Dayan saying Israel must be like a mad dog, too dangerous to bother. I mean, your viewers may wish to revisit the reasoning of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird as to what's to be done with mad dogs.
Sorry, I was muted there for a second. interesting literary reference there that I'll leave for people to explore on their own. Before I let you go, I do want to make sure that we talk about this potential war crimes prosecution that you and some other lawyers have been pursuing regarding these 10 British. I'll just read part of the Guardian report on this. So it was a 240-page dossier submitted to Scotland Yard's War Crimes Unit, alleging targeted killing of civilians and aid workers, including by sniper fire, and indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas, including hospitals. And this report, which was prepared by yourself and others, as well as researchers, accuses these 10 British citizens of engaging in coordinated attacks on historic monuments, religious sites, forced transfer and displacement of civilians, etc. And the whole thing is laid out in this 240-page dossier. Lay this case out. Explain for people what this is. You're asking the British police essentially to open a war crimes investigation into these 10 British citizens because of their participation in what you've alleged are war crimes that they participated in Gaza.
Yes, that's right. I'm part of a team led by Paul Heron at the Public Interest Law Centre, a formidable solicitors firm in this country. And there's a team of 5 barristers, of whom I'm one. I don't want to take more credit than I'm due, but I have been involved in that project for more than a year. And some of the other barristers have done some formidable work, some legwork. I, of course, have seen the 10 names on that list. So I know the 10 suspects, and I've seen the evidence against them, and it is extensive. And so it's to be hoped that the British police, whatever we might think of them and whatever we think their priorities might be, will take a look at the extensive evidence that we've provided to them and take the view, yes, there's no basis for doubting, actually. And of course, there's no basis for doubting. This is my point about the emperor's new clothes. We have to pretend to think that Israel is something other than an apartheid state committing a genocide when even the ICJ is telling us that that's what's happened. So the ICC, again, we can criticize it, but at least it did hand down some arrest warrants, and that is something of a game changer, right? Yoav Gallant, and more to the point, the sitting Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, are fugitives of international law. And if they come to the UK, they will be arrested under an international warrant, right? And that tends to suggest that, I mean, who can say what the future holds? I'm not here to make prognostications or predictions, but it does seem as though Israel's certainly in a crisis, and it seems like it's a terminal crisis. Like, how can you have it that your prime minister needs to be arrested by his closest allies if he comes to the territory of their jurisdiction? It's like he has a problem, doesn't he? Israel has a deeper problem that might be terminal. We might be in this South Africa 94 moment, and if that's right, then these prosecutions is only sort of part of that picture. It's like, look, the Israeli military depends in no small part on having this diaspora, this racialized diaspora, right? The Basic Law 1950 says every Jew may return to Israel as an ole. And then Israeli society says, if you're a woman, 2 years, if you're a man, 3 years. Some exceptions, certainly if you're Palestinian, you don't have to serve for obvious reasons. But broadly, it's a racialized military, right? It's a military that almost defines itself literally in terms of the racial composition, right? It's an army that specifically selects Jews from around the diaspora to go and fight to advance US and NATO colonial interests. And that's why it's quite clearly, among other things, anti-Semitic, right? It's like, get Jews to go and fight this horrific ethno-national war of colonization and imperial control on what's clearly on behalf of US interests, right? And so that's the context. But broadly, the application to the Metropolitan Police is simple. It's that by various pieces of British legislation, international crimes have been domesticated. So they're also a crime under domestic British law. Seems as though these British citizens have gone to serve in the Israeli military, commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. And if they come back to this country, seems likely that they'll be getting a knock on the door from the British police saying, you need to be interviewed under caution, and I hope charged, because there's extremely persuasive evidence that they committed astonishing crimes against the people of Palestine.
What is, we only have a few minutes left with you, Frank, but what are the potential consequences if a prosecution is undertaken of them on war crimes charges in the UK? What potentially could happen in that event?
Well, they'll be charged, and then the normal criminal procedure will kick in. They'll be produced before a magistrate's court for a first appearance, in which they'll have to enter a plea and decide whether they're going to plead guilty to the crimes with which they're charged or not guilty. And if they plead guilty, they'll be sentenced. And presumably, given the seriousness of the crimes, they'll receive some kind of custodial sentence. And if they plead not guilty, then of course there'll be a trial in which they will have an opportunity to defend themselves, and they will be represented by lawyers. And I assume that those lawyers won't be met with this sort of ad hominem that's been leveled at me, because the British establishment is extremely hypocritical. They'll go in front of juries and have to try and defend themselves. And if the jury thinks that the evidence against them is sufficiently persuasive to justify a conviction, if they are sure beyond reasonable doubt, as the test is sometimes described, that the defendant in question is guilty, then that person will at that point be sentenced. And we can only hope, if the crimes that have been found proven against them are serious enough, that they will serve time in prison, and that will serve as an example to any British person thinking about going to serve in the colonial military of an apartheid state while it massacres Palestinian children, that maybe they might finally face some personal consequences.
I want to make sure anyone who's interested in reading about the case that Franck has primarily been talking about today, and that is the application put forward by Hamas to the British Home Secretary for deproscription as a terror organization in the UK, you can go to hamascase.com and read all of the documents. I think I found also quite interesting as a historical document the witness statements of Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk, who was a member of Hamas from the very, very beginning of the organization, where he not only talks about the events of October 7th, but also talks about the historical perspective of Hamas, the changing of we didn't get into this today, but the evolution of its charter, which is often, weaponized in debate, and also their views on anti-Semitism. I thought it was quite extraordinary to read Dr. Marzouk's comments about anti-Zionist Jews including in Israel, he even said in his witness statement, which I don't know that I've read that before from a Hamas official. It's whatever you think about this case, it's really important to look at the factual underpinnings of this application, especially at this moment when there's potentially going to be another round of negotiations. So Franck Magennis, I would say from the law firm Garden Court Chambers, but we don't know what's going to happen when you go into the meetings with them. But thank you very much for being with us and for the work that you're doing.
Gareth Mila Maya got Jeremy Slangerfoyle. I'll see you very soon. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Franck Magennis, of course, is a very experienced lawyer. He represents clients on a wide range of cases, really fascinating lawyer in the UK. And that does it for this special live stream of Drop Site News. Make sure to look for us wherever you get your podcasts. You can just search Drop Site News. If you can, leave us a rating or a review. It will help other people to find us. You can also support our work financially and otherwise by going to dropsitenews.com. We are able to process 501c3 tax-deductible donations. You can click on ways to give. We understand some people don't have change in their pocket to contribute right now. Times are tough. You can do your part by just spreading the word about our news organizations. I know people have complicated feelings about Elon Musk's X, but I really do encourage you to check out Drop Site News's feed on X. We have a great group of people that try to run it as a 24-hour news service, and I think it would be very valuable to public interest for people to check it out. On behalf of everybody at Drop Site News, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill.